So coming up in this episode, I'm going to be telling you guys everything you need to know about the X5 Everdrive for the Game Boy Advance, including how to get it all set up, some of the more interesting homebrew and ROM hack games that I've found for the system, and a lot more to come as well. I'll put links in the description to the timestamps throughout this video, so I really hope you enjoy. Let's get started. This is the latest version of the Everdrive for the GBA. There was an X5 before it, but this one's actually shaved off a little bit from the top to make it a little bit more compact, and it actually fits flush in the system now without sticking out, which is fantastic. So what is the Everdrive? Well, basically it's a flash cart for the Game Boy Advance that lets you put any games you want onto the little micro SD card, and you put that in the top, and then you can play any Game Boy Advance, any original Game Boy, or any Game Boy Color game, as well as ROM hacks and Homebrew Games for all of those systems too. Just like the Everdrive for the Game Boy that came before it, it comes in this really nice box here with a really nice foam insert. There's no instructions or anything, you have to find out all of that online, but hopefully by watching this video you won't need any instructions. So let's first take a closer look at the cartridge as well as how to get it all set up. So here's a closer look at the cartridge itself. As you can see, it's very similar to a standard Game Boy Advance cartridge, but it does have a few key differences. For one thing, it has a micro SD card slot on the top, and it also has the sides shaved off, whereas a regular Game Boy Advance game has little grooves that come out the side, whereas this is completely flat. One notable omission from the Game Boy Advance Everdrive compared to the Game Boy Everdrive though, is the fact that there's no built-in button. I really like the fact that on the Game Boy Everdrive you could actually squeeze the cartridge itself to return to the main menu at any point, whereas with the Game Boy Advance one, you actually have to switch the system on and off to be able to go back to the main menu, so that's a little bit of a disappointment. So to set up the Everdrive to be able to play your games on, first you need to make sure that the SD card is formatted to FAT32. If you haven't got it formatted already, do that first and then go to this website here, I'll put a link in the description, and download the latest version of the OS. So the latest one in this example is from 2018, so you just want to drag that into the root of the SD card and you should have the same file that I'm showing here. Now next, I'm also going to download all of the different emulators that are compatible with the system. So there's this one here for Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Like I said, I will put links in the description to all of these so you can download them for yourself, and all you need to do is drag in the Game Boy Advance file into that GBA system folder that appeared earlier. So go ahead and do that for the rest of the emulators. I actually just found out that there's also an emulator for Game Gear and Sega Master System, which is fantastic, so I can't wait to try those out later. So here's me downloading the Master System emulator. Once again, just drag the file into the folder that was created when you set up the SD card. And then once you've got all that set up, the next thing you'll want to do is set up a few folders to add your games into. So as you can see here, I went through and added a lot of different folders for all of the different types of games that I'll be playing on it, including every single file and folder that was on my original GB Everdrive, because this can also play all of the stuff that I had on there as well, including all of the original Game Boy homebrew releases. So it's just great to be able to have everything in one place. So here's what my folder structure looks like at the end of all that. Hopefully you guys will have something similar, and then all you need to do is eject the SD card, put it into the Game Boy Advance, and fingers crossed you'll be on your way to playing all the amazing games that you've got downloaded. If anyone has any trouble setting it up, please leave me a comment down below and I'll do my best to help you out. So I hope that was easy enough for you guys to follow along with. It is fairly straightforward, so now let's take a look at what it actually looks like when you turn the system on and how to navigate through all the menus. So here's how that folder structure looks on the system itself. Anything that's highlighted in yellow is a folder, and anything that's highlighted in grey is an actual file that you can load up. So for example here, the Super Mario Advance games, they're clickable because they're in grey. Also, if you press the select button, you get a few different options. There's an option here to hide the GBA system menu, which is probably something you want to do because that's not something you'd actually want to access on the system itself. There's also a recently played list which shows I think about 10 games that you've played recently, so you can easily go back and play something rather than trying to find it in all the different folders. There's also a few different options in here, such as the device information, just to check that you're running on the latest firmware. So it's a very simple and straightforward menu to navigate, and I think it works surprisingly well. The colour scheme isn't quite as nice as the Game Boy Everdrive version though. There's a few other more detailed options as well. For example, if you want to see the hex code for the games, you can do that, as well as seeing a bit more information from the ROM themselves. Something that's really important that I'll get back to later is finding out what the save file version is for the games. So like I said, in some ways the Game Boy Everdrive actually runs a little bit nicer than the Game Boy Advance one, but even so, it's a really clean and simple interface, and it just makes getting to the games really straightforward. So now let's take a look at some games that you can only play on the Game Boy by using one of these, and these are Homebrew Games. And I do want to make a full video about GBA Homebrew Games in the future, so I'm only going to show off a few of them now, but definitely look forward to more to come in the future, so please subscribe if you want to see some of them. So the first homebrew game we're looking at here is a really fun, simple little platformer called Power Pig, made for a coding competition in 2013. It plays very similarly to a Taito classic like Liquid Kids or Bubble Bobble. I really did enjoy this one, and I'm definitely going to give it more of a go in the future, and maybe even revisit it for a future video. And the second homebrew game we're looking at here is one called Anguna. This was released simultaneously on the GBA and the DS back in 2008, and it's a really good top-down action-adventure game consisting of 5 different dungeons and an overworld. It's incredibly impressive, and it almost seems like it could have been a real physical release. And I actually think it would have sold really well, and this is another one that I definitely want to revisit in the future. Now of course, as well as homebrew games, there's one other really exciting thing that you can do with this, and that is actually playing unreleased Game Boy Advance games that developers themselves have actually uploaded to the internet for people to try out. I've found some really fascinating stuff, but like I said with the homebrew games, I'm going to save most of it for a separate video, but please enjoy this little preview now.
Resident Evil 2. A bizarre incident occurred in the outskirts of an American...
So yes, at one point Resident Evil 2 was considered to be made for the Game Boy. Unfortunately the project fell through, but thankfully this version of the game is still playable. I think it looks absolutely incredible. Unfortunately it is a very short tech demo, it's literally just this starting area that you can see here, but even so, what an incredible tech demo it is. But one that I was even more excited to find was the original pre-release version of Banjo Pilot. Of course this game came out in 2005, but it didn't look anything like this. I was amazed to find that the original version that was shown off in 2001, this fully 3D version that you can see here, was actually completely playable and dumped online, and it just blows my mind that I'm actually able to play these games that I saw in the past being advertised but got cancelled. And as well as that, I also found the cancelled Diddy Kong Pilot version of Banjo Pilot, which is a lot closer to the final version of the game, but of course it includes Diddy Kong and all of those characters rather than a Banjo cast of characters, which is really interesting to see. And I would love to do an in-depth video about all these different discoveries that I've found in the future. Now, as well as brand new games and unreleased games, there's a few really cool things that you can do with official releases too. The first of which that I'm going to show off in this video is some ROM hacks. These basically take the original games and improve them in various ways. I'll probably also do a future video about this, but here's just a few really interesting ones that I've found so far. If you saw my Game Boy ROM hacks video a few weeks ago, you'll already be familiar with this, but if you didn't, here's a very quick rundown of how they work. Basically, ROM hacks come as an IPS file, and you need to patch the original game in order to create the hacked version. So you can see here that I've got a hack for the original Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Advance, which fixes all of the colours. If you weren't aware, Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Advance brightens everything, because originally the GBA didn't have a backlit screen. But these days, thanks to all of the backlight technology, you don't really need that increased brightness anymore. So there's a lot of hacks out there that actually change the colours back to what they were supposed to be, and as you can see, it works extremely well, and it looks even more impressive when you're playing it on the actual system itself. It's actually really close to the SNES original, and it's definitely my preferred way of playing the game on the Game Boy Advance these days. And as well as ROM hacks, the other thing that I think is really great, it's fantastic to be able to play fan translation patches on the original system by using the Everdrive. I've only actually played one of them using this so far, and that is Magical Vacation. So take a look at how Magical Vacation runs on the actual system itself in English. It's just fantastic to be able to play this. And now on to the next really interesting point, which is the fact that this GBA Everdrive can also run a few emulators, including Game Boy and Game Boy Color and NES as well. The emulation for the original Game Boy games isn't quite 100%, so you might notice occasional dips in frame rate, but it really wasn't enough to put me off enjoying the games. And another amazing thing, which I'm going to cover in more detail later on, is the fact that they also include Super Game Boy border support for the Game Boy games themselves. So Game Boy games play fantastically on this system, and the other amazing thing is that using this Everdrive you can actually play original Game Boy games now on the Game Boy Micro, which was impossible before. There are a few options. If you press L and R at the same time, you can do things like add a frame rate counter to the screen, speed the games up slightly and change the colour palettes, which is fun to mess around with. There's also save state support, so if you want to stop playing at any point, you can just choose a save state and then reload it so you can start exactly where you left off next time. Now let's take a look at how NES games work on it by taking a look at my favourite game for the system, Mega Man 4. As you can see, it looks quite nice. The screen is a little bit squashed though, and if you take a look at this menu here, if you've ever played one of those 101 Game Boy Advance cartridges, you might recognise this because yes, this is an open source emulator. There's a few different scaling options, but none of them seem to look quite right. You can actually turn scaling off completely, but that blocks the bottom or the top half of the screen. Some games work with something called sprite following, but unfortunately I couldn't get that to work with Mega Man, so I was left with a bit of a squashed display. There is a way to turn on something called sprite flicker, which kind of makes the sprites look a little bit better, but overall, maybe the GBA isn't the best place to play NES games. Another system that does work really well though is the Game Gear and Sega Master System emulators, especially the Game Gear one. Take a look at me playing through Sonic 1 on the Game Gear here, and of course this emulator also has a wealth of options when you press L and R, including something really fascinating, which is the ability to get rid of the border and actually play the original Game Gear game in widescreen. As you can see, it makes a few little artifacts at the bottom and the sides of the screens, but I just thought it was really interesting to see that there's all this going on outside of the usual range of the screen that you can see playing it on the Game Gear. And the final system that we're looking at here is Sega Master System, with one of my favourite games for that system, Golvelius. And I actually think this looks slightly better than the NES emulator. It does utilise the same scaling techniques as the NES one, but I think they did a slightly better job here. I'm not sure whether that's because Master System games have more in common with Game Gear, and that emulator seemed to run a little bit smoother, but even so, it's great to be able to have all of these different consoles available to play in one place. So the amazing thing with the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games is the fact that when you play them through this, you also have the choice of using the Super Game Boy borders, which before this was completely impossible on any of the Game Boy systems. And even more amazing than using Game Boy borders is the fact that you can actually use the borders in conjunction with the Game Boy Color versions of the games. And this just completely blew my mind when I found out about this. Have a look at the difference here with Dragon Quest Monsters. So here's Dragon Warrior Monsters running on the SNES, and as you can see it has this fantastic Super Game Boy border, but the game itself is still in black and white. Which isn't really a problem because the game still looks really nice, but wouldn't it be good if the game could actually play in full colour? There is one thing though that the SNES can do that the Everdrive can't, as far as I'm aware, and that is actually change the backgrounds depending on what's going on in the game. So as you saw there, when the character teleported to the other world, the background actually changed to this really nice forest scene. And just for comparison, here's how the game looks running in its Game Boy Color form. As you can see, the colours are really nice and vibrant, so wouldn't it be great if you could mix these colours with the Super Game Boy border and get the full experience? Well, that is exactly what you can do playing the game on the Game Boy Emulator on the GBA Everdrive. Just take a look at this, isn't this so cool? My mind really was blown when I first saw this. Unfortunately though, like I said, once you get to this bit where you go through the teleporter, the background doesn't actually change. And I've tried all of the different settings that I could find and I couldn't find a way of getting the border to swap. As you can see here, there's different options, so you can actually choose whether you want the game in black and white or in colour, or whether you want to treat it as a Super Game Boy game or as an original Game Boy game. You can actually also mess with all of the different colour palettes that would be available if you were playing it on a Super Game Boy, which is really cool. And as well as that, this is the only possible way of playing Game Boy games on a Game Boy Micro, which I just think is so cool. And to have the whole screen filled up with the borders along the side, it really is fantastic, and I had so much fun playing through some of my classic Game Boy games this way. So isn't that just absolutely amazing? Now there's one other amazing thing that I found out about this, and that is the fact that if you've got a system like the RetroBreak or the Retron 5, which I've also done videos about in the past, so if you've got one of those systems you can actually put on custom firmware onto the hardware itself, and that actually allows you to take your original Game Boy Advance games, dump the ROMs and the save files from those games, and then put your real actual save files and ROMs of the games onto the Everdrive. And I've done that with quite a few games from my collection so far, and I have to say it's a really simple process. I won't go into all the detail now, but I will put a link in the description so you can go and check out a user guide if you've got a RetroBreak, and take a look at some of this quick footage to see how it works for yourself. I was really blown away by the result, and it's just fantastic that I don't have to feel guilty about downloading ROMs and putting them on here. I can actually dump my official games and get the official save files and play them on there that way, which just makes me feel a lot better about the whole thing. So the actual process of getting this working on the RetroBreak is a little bit complicated and probably outside of the scope of this video, so please have a look in the description for detailed instructions of how to do this, but I can promise you that it's worth figuring out. So as you can see here, what I mentioned earlier about the save types, you can see this one says SRAM, so that means that you actually need to rename the save file that came out of the RetroBreak. And the Advance Wars one there is a flash file, so I think that one's FLA and I think the other one is SRM, so you need to make sure that you rename the files to the correct format, and then all you need to do is put those dumped ROMs into your ROMs folder and put the saves into the saves folder, which comes pre-installed on the Everdrive, and away you go playing your original games with your original save file. So there we go. I really hope you've enjoyed this overview of the GBA Everdrive. If you've got any questions at all, let me know down in the comments below and I will try and answer as many as I can. And if I think any of the questions need it, I will also make a follow-up to this video to answer them and share all that knowledge with you guys. So I really hope you enjoyed it. If you want to buy one for yourself, I will put a link in the description so you can go and check out the Cricks website and see if they're available in your area. That's it for this episode. Thank you all so much for watching. Please don't forget to comment, subscribe if you enjoyed it. Check out Patreon where I'll be doing behind the scenes episodes of all my new videos going forward. That's it for now. See you next week for the next episode. Goodbye.